before I shared it to the Migration Project, I've been thinking, I started writing my memoir back in 2019, and I wasn't writing it to be published. I was writing it to heal from just some personal um, challenges that I was going through. And I realized that I wanted to share that story. So originally, I didn't think of it as a story to be published in a literary sense. It was more of an account, something that I wanted to express in writing, again, for healing, something that I felt was unresolved and couldn't be resolved until it was spoken. What moved me was not really the confidence. It was more, I wasn't searching to be understood. I wasn't looking for an audience. In fact, the opposite of that, I wanted clarity of what I was going through. I wanted to express that migration of where I'd been, where I was, what I was going through, what we call the story. I wanted to understand that distance between my feelings and what I was projecting. It was less about exposure, less about readership, less about sharing. It was more of what it could do for me and the complexities that I was experiencing in my life to try to get that clarity, right?
Mhm.
I would say that there was a moment after, earlier we were talking about submissions and people submitting to this. There was a moment when I considered not submitting, and it wasn't so much because I didn't think my story was worth sharing. It was more, could I find the right language? Could I tweak this to fit into the story of becoming and belonging, right? I knew that a lot of what I was talking about was belonging, but I had to pull back to understand how this was also a sense of becoming, right? And so I think that's where the migration is from from the movement, from where I, not only the physical movement, but the spiritual and the emotional movement of what migration does to you. Definitely. So as you know, the story that I shared with you in the Migration Project evolved into my memoir. And originally, I had submitted a few chapters to close friends and said, "Would you read this? Would this resonate with you?" Uh, and I got great feedback, partially because I was allowing people to look deeper into who I was. When you write, you expose your soul, you feel vulnerable, but at the same time, what you realize is you're opening a door because others can understand you and you can help them understand themselves. And that was part of the healing as well. And that's a certain sense of belonging, right? When you realize that there's that connection between what you're writing and what people experience when they read your writing and how it sits with them. In terms of my work, the story did not redirect me as much as it clarified an existing trajectory. It became those three chapters became actual chapters in the wider story that I was creating in the memoir that I was putting together. So it did give birth to a project that became a lot bigger than where I started. It will be published in October, I believe October 26th of or 27th of this year. So
Uh,
really excited. It's published by a publisher in the States, Broadleaf Publishers. And what I love about Broadleaf is they're primarily a Christian-based organization. They do publish a wide array of work, and not just spiritual and not just Christian. And so when they approached me, I was ecstatic because this is the first time I was published. I had pre-published before. I'm an indie publisher, but working with them um, has been really a learning experience as well. And we wanted to coincide with Islamic Awareness Month in the United States with everything that's going on around the world right now. I think the timing of this book will really hopefully reach out to people and help them understand the other a lot better. When people hear the word memoir, they think, "Oh, okay, why would I read about this person's story, about this person's life? Why should I care?" And what I try to portray in my memoir is not just one person's story, but it's a tapestry of our shared stories, of our shared humanity, of what we experience, what people have experienced before us, what people who are peers are experiencing now, and what people will experience after. So it may be my story, but how many people migrate from a homeland to a new home and face the pressures and the challenges of belonging and understanding how they are becoming in a new environment. And so while the stories and the anecdotes that I share and the tales that I tell, and they're all true and real, they're not just mine. And when you read the book, inshallah, you'll read the book, and I thank you in advance for being one of the endorsers. Uh, there's only three people who are mentioned by name. So the book's called My Name is Mohammed.
Hmm.
And, I was very intentional about not naming people in my book, with the exception of three teachers who had a huge influence on me. Now, I mentioned the book is primarily mentioned to dedicated to my mother, to my wife and my children. I talk about how these people have impacted my life and influenced me. But I don't mention them by name for a few reasons. One is I don't believe I have the right to mention these people by name, whether it's my wife or my children, because this story is about me and the people in my life. And I haven't really taken permission from those around me to talk about their story. So it is primarily the story of My Name is Mohammed. Now, you might say, okay, well, why have you mentioned your teachers? Those teachers, as much as my family, my mother, my wife, my children, my friends and family have impacted me, maybe more than anything else in my life, these three teachers, I mentioned them by name because they are sort of heroes in my journey to reclaim my name of Muhammad. The impact that they had on me as a child, newly arrived in Canada, as a young man growing up and trying to find my identity through a variety of different names that I had worn like masks because I thought I can't be Muhammad. I can't use that name. People are Islamophobic. People don't like Muslims, right? And so I always had to hide behind something a lot less vulnerable. And so I was named Mike when I first came to Canada. I was given that name, like you're given a pencil case to start your first day of school. I embraced Mikel out of a joke, or one day in French class, my friend was sitting beside me. She goes, "Oh, Mikel," and she said it like Michelle My Belle, the song. And I said, I like that. And I took it on and I forced people to call me by Mikel. I would refuse to answer when people call me Mike. So I went through that process until I traveled to Spain and I'd come back to live in Toronto. And I finally started to rediscover my roots. And through the series of wars that my country, my homeland, Lebanon, had undergone, I started to realize that the masks that I had worn, I realized they had been, I had to remove them. And in removing these masks, I was able to see the real person inside, and that person belonged to me and belonged to the name Muhammad. And so even today, when I use the name Muhammad, I still shake sometimes. It's like a scar. You see it on your hand. It's healed, but it's always there to remind you. And my name, Muhammad, as proud as I am to carry that name, right? It's the most popular male name in the world. I still feel sometimes vulnerable because of the way people will react when they hear the name Muhammad. So I wear it with pride and dignity. That doesn't mean that sometimes there aren't those feelings of not shame, but almost fear, especially when you look at what's happening in the world right now. People will look at me and say, "You don't look like a Muhammad. You don't look Muslim. You don't look like you're from the Middle East." And I and so that name is a door. And it depends how people decide to open or close the door in front of you. It puts you in a position where you have to be the main character in your story. And if people decide to close that door, you open up another one. Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And Nancy, we primarily think of migration, and I love the fact that you've called that it is a transformation. And because it is a transformation, some of the migration that we experience isn't just physical, right? So,
No.
I think of how we continue to transform And that's part of the migration of us living in this country, living in Canada. You're originally Italian, I'm originally Lebanese, right? We may have experienced this transformation less had we remained in our homelands, right?
Hmm?
But I think coming to Canada and being in this melting pot of different cultures and experiences, it you have to awaken to this new awareness that migration is part of every one of our stories. And when you asked earlier about the book, that's at the essence of why this book will resonate with so many people. Yeah, it may be about one small town Ontario boy called Mohammed, but how many Mohammeds were out there? How many Mikes were out there, right? And each one of us has gone through that transformation. What surprised me was how little control I had over the piece and what it revealed to me while I was writing it. I began with a sense of what I wanted to say, but the act of writing exposed connections, tensions even, that I hadn't fully considered. So, it took on a life of its own. Another point, I guess, that you can say of surprise that came a little later was not with the original piece that I submitted to you, but with, as I mentioned, the memoir.
Mhm.
The migration piece did not have a readership, right? I submitted that and it didn't have the readership of editors and so forth.
Mhm.
And so when I started morphing that into My Name is Mohammed, it took on a different response from editors who, they didn't just react to the text, they asked questions that expose what I was assuming with the work, how I was compressing or leaving certain things unexamined. And in that sense, the story didn't remain fixed. It was transforming, as you say, over time as it was written. And, it was tested. And through that test, there was a lot of clarity that came out of that as well. Little as a kid, I was a kid and I'd be walking home from school. I was in grade three, newly arrived in Canada. I'd be playing with the puddles at the end of the road, at the end, the curb. And when it rained, there was always the rainfall
Yeah.
washing down. And in my mind, there was a reel that was turning. And I thought of myself telling a story about myself. I'd always seen myself as this main character in my story. I don't know why, and it's not an egoistic, it's
Mhm.
it wasn't the ego speaking. It was my voice. And I felt that as young as at the age of the age of 8 in grade 3, I had this reel in my head. And as I grew up, this reel was always turned into introspection and later into words and into the story. Yeah, when I decided to share that story on paper, I realized that maybe there are certain things that didn't need to be shared. You know, as you can tell, I'm not the most brief person. If you ask me a question, I'll spin it out into much detail. And while that may be important to me, to us individuals, as individuals, to the readership, it may not be as important. So when I was working with my editors, when I was working with the publisher, there were stories and complete chapters that were cut out. There were stories about family and friends, and there was chapters about God, and there was chapters about my cat, right? And they were part of my life and part of my story, but my readers felt that maybe they weren't part of the story and the way the tapestry of the story, how it was coming together, they were probably loose threads that
Mm.
took away from the overall manuscript as opposed to strengthen it. And I think that's very important as readers. We have to remember that while we want our to share our stories, we want it to be read and experienced. And so sometimes deciding and being intentional of not sharing everything,
Mm.
not for fear, but to make the story more powerful. And that's where I think, a good editor comes in because they'll give you that feedback and they'll say, this just doesn't quite sit well. And
Mm.
I pushed back. There were times where I pushed back and, we found a happy balance. But a lot of the time I did stand back and I realized that my editors were spot on. Some, even to whole chapters that were taken out, it made sense. They didn't necessarily belong in that story. Our stories, they're not singular stories. My story wasn't just written in one singular voice. It carries the presence of my parents, whose language of a place, their decisions, circumstances that preceded my own. It carries the language of a place that doesn't translate cleanly into another. It carries the expectations, silences, interpretations of a community that understands part of the story without needing to have that story be explained. At the same time, I wanted to resist the tendency to claim that I'm speaking for others, right?
Mhm.
I didn't want to preach. I didn't want to write essays. And maybe that's where it was good that some of those chapters were actually taken out because they were very essayistic. They were a little too dogmatic, right?
Mhm.
I was grateful for my readers for pointing that out because they didn't belong with the voice of the story that I was telling. So, what is present are the pieces and traces of other lives as they intersected with mine.
Mhm.
The influence is real, but it's mediated through my perception and my limits. So the more accurate answer is that multiple voices are present, but they're not fully represented. They can be. Um, it's a piece that reflects an encounter with those voices and not their totality. Their story is already belonging. It already belongs. It's a matter of sharing that story. So, I would wholeheartedly question the premise behind the hesitation. I may not have the right to do so, as another human being, as a writer, someone through the process, I would. If the concern is whether the story is worth telling, worth according to whom, external validation, it's an unstable measure. Many stories do not fit prevailing expectations. However, if the concern is whether it will be understood, that may be partially true. Some aspects won't be understood by every reader, but complete understanding is not a prerequisite for telling something honestly.
Mhm.
So if somebody sits with my book and they're reading it, my expectation is not that they're going to feel exactly what I did. They're going to interpret it. It's like language. If I say blue, you might think of the way that, the color of the sky. I may be referring to the way that the sky reflects on the water and turns the color of the water blue. Each one of us will have a different interpretation for the color blue. So, rather than offering encouragement in the abstract, I would suggest a more precise approach. Write it first without deciding whether it's worthwhile. Let the act of writing clarify what the story is asking of you, and only then decide what to do with it. You and Rocco have been incredibly kind, uh, very directional. So
Mhm.
you've provided some key insights. I didn't expect to win the award and to be chosen for writing the piece as I did. Of course, I'm glad that I was. And I'm sure that the other stories that were submitted were equally valid and beautifully written and worthy of being shared. So writing isn't about recognition. I think first and foremost, it's a process of understanding yourself, finding that clarity and working through it and navigating through the dense forest of words and thoughts and feelings and emotions and perspectives, and not necessarily coming out of the forest and into a clearing where you found something awesome and informative, but at least feeling safer that you can sit with your words and you can reflect and you know that your words can make a difference with someone else. And I think that's, for me, because this is the first time I've published, I've always craved helping others and sharing my experiences so that their lives could be easier,
Mhm.
especially as an immigrant. Writing now provided me another platform to be able to do just that.